In 1977, the Central African Republic was one of the poorest nations on Earth. More than half its population survived on less than $1 a day. Infant mortality was among the highest in the world. There were almost no paved roads outside the capital. Hospitals existed on paper. Schools operated without teachers. This was the country. This was the moment. And on December 4th, 1977, a man who ruled this country decided it was time to throw himself the most expensive party in Central African history. His name was Jean-Bédel Bokassa, and what he did that day was not simply theft. It was a declaration of exactly who he believed himself to be, and exactly how little he believed his people were worth. He ordered 60,000 bottles of champagne from France, shipped to a country where children were dying of malnutrition. He imported 240 tons of gourmet food for a feast that would last one night in a country where most people ate once a day. He commissioned a throne, cast in bronze, gilded in gold, that cost more than $2 million. He wore a cape, a replica of Napoleon Bonaparte's coronation robe, lined in white ermine fur in a country where the average temperature rarely drops below 90 degrees. The total cost, $22 million. That was 1/4 of the entire country's annual budget. It was also the exact amount France had given the Central African Republic in aid that year. Every dollar, gone, in a single afternoon. This is the story of how a man becomes a monster, and how the systems around him let it happen. Let's go back to the beginning. Jean-Bédel Bokassa was born on February 22, 1921 in the village of Bobangi, a small settlement in the heart of Central Africa, deep inside the French colonial system. His father was a village chief, a man of standing, a man of pride. When Jean-Bédel was 6 years old, his father was killed, executed by French colonial authorities after leading a protest against forced labor. 1 week later, unable to survive the grief, the shame, and the impossible weight of 12 children, his mother walked into the river and did not come back. Jean-Bédel Bokassa was 6 years old. He had just lost everything. The Catholic missionaries who took him in gave him an education, gave him a language, and gave him an idol, a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. That detail will matter. At 18, Bokassa joined the French colonial army, not for France, not for any ideology, for the only thing that made sense to a boy who had lost his father to colonialism and been raised inside it. He was a soldier, a good one. He fought in Indochina. He served in Algeria. He collected 12 military decorations from the country that had executed his father. The psychology of that sentence could fill an entire book. By 1964, he was a colonel, the first black colonel in the Central African Republic. He was strong, organized, respected. He studied Napoleon obsessively. He memorized his campaigns. He collected portraits. He believed, genuinely believed, that greatness worked the same way it did for Napoleon. Through will, through force, through absolute conviction that you were chosen. On January 1st, 1966, while his cousin President David Dacko slept, Bokassa launched a coup. The government fell in hours. No one died. The streets were quiet. And Jean-Bédel Bokassa, orphan, soldier, Napoleon obsessive, became the president of the Central African Republic. For a moment, some people thought it might go well. In his first years, Bokassa moved fast. He built an airport, a university, a hospital. He nationalized mines and farms. He spoke the language of development. People were cautious, but cautiously hopeful. Then, quietly at first, the other Bokassa began to emerge. Political opponents disappeared. Men who questioned him in cabinet were found beaten in cells. One minister who plotted against him, a man who had helped Bokassa take power, was dragged through the streets of Bangui and shot publicly, as a warning. In 1972, Bokassa declared himself president for life. In 1974, Marshal of the Republic. Each title a step further from accountability. Each title a step closer to something no one wanted to name out loud. But none of those titles were enough. He was reading Napoleon again. And Napoleon had been an emperor. December 4th, 1977. Bokassa announced to the world that he was no longer president, no longer marshal. He was, from this moment forward, His Imperial Majesty, Bokassa I, Emperor of Central Africa. He spent 14 months preparing the coronation. He sent horsemen to equestrian schools in France to learn ceremonial riding. He ordered 8 Belgian stallions to pull his carriage. He imported his Napoleon cape from Paris, white ermine lining, silk, in 35-degree Central African heat. The throne was cast in bronze, covered in gilded gold, shaped like a giant eagle, Bokassa's symbol. It cost $2.5 million alone. He imported 60,000 bottles of champagne. He flew in 240 tons of the finest food from across Europe and Asia, food for 600 guests, in a country where people lined up for a single meal. He sent personal invitations to every major world leader: the Emperor of Japan, the Shah of Iran, the Pope, the Queen of England. None of them came. Not one foreign head of state attended. The event went ahead anyway. In a country where 66% of the population survived on less than $1 a day, Bokassa spent $22 million, 1/4 of the country's entire annual budget. Every franc France had given them in aid that year. Gone. In a single afternoon. And when it was over, when the champagne was gone and the horses had been sent back and the dignitaries had returned to countries that still had functioning governments, the people of the Central African Republic woke up the next morning in exactly the same country they'd always lived in, only now, considerably poorer. Bokassa didn't notice. He was already planning his next palace. To understand Bokassa, you have to understand what power does to a man who had nothing. He was 6 years old when his world ended. He had no father, no mother, no home. He spent his childhood being educated by the very empire that killed his father, learning its language, its manners, its values. He was shaped by France. He was celebrated by France. He was decorated by France. And then he was given a country. What does a man do when he has been given the power to rewrite everything he was told he was? He rewrites it completely. Napoleon had an empire. Napoleon had a throne. Napoleon had a coronation. So Bokassa would too. Not because he needed it, not because it served his country, but because no 6-year-old boy who watched his father die and his mother disappear ever fully believes he deserves the power he holds. And when you don't believe you deserve it, you perform it, louder, more expensively, more absolutely, until the performance becomes the only reality
January
you can survive. 1979. Bokassa issued a decree. All students in the Central African Republic, from elementary school through university, were required to wear official school uniforms. Standard enough. Except for one detail. The uniforms could only be purchased from a single approved manufacturer, a company owned by one of his wives. The price of the uniforms was more than most families earned in a month. Parents couldn't pay. Children couldn't attend school. The students began to protest. They were children. They carried signs. They marched through the streets of Bangui. They threw stones at a passing vehicle, a Rolls Royce, Bokassa's Rolls Royce. No one knows if he was in it. What we know is what happened next. On April 18, 1979, students were arrested across Bangui, hundreds of them. They were taken to Ngaragba prison, the most feared facility in the country. What happened inside those walls was documented later, by witnesses, by investigators, by the Amnesty International report that changed everything. Approximately 100 children, elementary school students, the youngest reported as young as 8 years old, were beaten to death. The evidence collected afterward suggested Bokassa himself participated. When news reached the outside world, there was a moment, rare in Cold War politics, of genuine, unified condemnation. Not because condemnation was common, but because this time, there were too many dead children for anyone to look away. France, which had funded his coronation, which had sent horses for his carriage, which had treated him as a legitimate ally for over a decade, finally stopped looking away. For a long time, the world had been watching Bokassa the way people watch a fire that isn't yet at their door. Then, the door opened. In September 1979, while Bokassa was out of the country, visiting Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, France moved. Operation Barracuda. 300 French paratroopers landed at Bangui Airport, secured the capital, reinstated the previous president, David Dacko. It took less than 12 hours. The Central African Empire, which had existed for exactly 2 years, 9 months, and 17 days, ceased to exist. When French soldiers entered Bokassa's palaces, they found what no one had officially confirmed. In the walk-in freezers at Villa Colongo, human remains. In the grounds of Barengo Palace, bones. The remnants of those fed to his pet crocodiles. The rumors that had circulated for years, the ones that diplomats had chosen not to believe, that Western governments had chosen not to pursue, were no longer rumors. Bokassa fled to Ivory Coast, then to France, into a comfortable exile in the country that had made him, and then unmade him. 7 years later, Bokassa made a decision that surprised everyone. He returned. Voluntarily, he flew back to the Central African Republic in 1986, a country where he had already been tried in absentia and sentenced to death. No one fully understood why. Some say he believed he would be welcomed. Some say he had simply run out of exile that felt like living. He was arrested at the airport. The trial began December 15, 1986, and it was unlike anything the continent had seen. The courtroom was open to the public. Every session was broadcast live. Radio Bangui carried the proceedings across Central Africa. The charges were read aloud for hours. Murder, embezzlement, illegal detention, torture, and the charge that made the world pay attention: cannibalism. His former chef testified. He described in clinical, careful language what he had been instructed to prepare in the palace kitchen. The cannibalism charge was ultimately ruled insufficient evidence. The murder conviction stood. The sentence, death, which was commuted to life imprisonment, then to 20 years. In 1993, under a general amnesty, Bokassa I, former emperor of Central Africa, was released. He died at home in Bangui on November 3, 1996, of a heart attack, in his bed, unremarkably. Today, the palace at Barengo is a ruin. Jungle has consumed most of the buildings. Looters took what the years didn't. His tomb is covered in bathroom tiles and corrugated steel. A bronze statue of Bokassa, 3.5 meters tall, still stands in the courtyard. Nobody removed it. The village around it still lives in simple mud houses. The Central African Republic remains one of the poorest nations on earth. Its GDP did not recover to pre-Bokassa levels until 9 years after his removal. Some economists argue it still hasn't fully recovered. Bokassa's story is often told as an aberration, a madman, a monster, an outlier, something so extreme it could only happen in a certain kind of place, in a certain kind of time, to a certain kind of person. That framing is comfortable. It is also wrong. Bokassa was not an aberration. He was a result. He was the result of a colonial system that executed his father, and then recruited his son. He was the result of a Cold War world where France maintained 60 years of neo-colonial relationships with African governments, regardless of what those governments did to their people, as long as they remained useful. France funded his coronation. France sent him horses. France's president accepted his diamonds. France removed him only when dead children made the relationship too expensive to maintain publicly. That is not the behavior of a country that was shocked by what Bokassa was doing. That is the behavior of a country that had decided, for a very long time, that what Bokassa was doing was an acceptable cost. This is what political complicity looks like. Not dramatic, not theatrical, quiet, consistent, profitable. And then there is the man himself. The psychology of Bokassa is not the psychology of a monster. It is the psychology of a wound that was given access to an army. A boy who watched his father die and his mother disappear, who was then educated by the empire that killed his father, built a throne. Because thrones are what you build when the alternative is sitting with what you lost and what you were never given. That does not excuse what he did. Not the theft, not the torture, not the children. Nothing excuses the children. But it explains how ordinary humans, shaped by extraordinary violence, can become the architects of their own worst chapters. Power does not create the monster. It reveals what was always there, and removes every obstacle that would have kept it quiet. The Central African Republic has had 10 heads of state since Bokassa. It has been at war in one form or another for most of the decades since. The palace at Barengo is being slowly eaten by the jungle. His throne, the $2.5 million eagle, the great symbol of absolute power, is in a storage facility in Paris. The children who died in Ngaragba prison in April 1979 have no monument. The families who could not afford his school uniforms, who watched their children arrested for protesting, have received no formal acknowledgement. Jean-Bédel Bokassa spent $22 million on a single day, a day to tell himself, and the world, that he was not the orphaned 6-year-old boy whose father had been erased by a colonial power. He was never going to be able to spend enough to prove that. There is no throne large enough. There is no crown heavy enough. There is no palace expensive enough to fill the space left by a father who walked out of your world when you were 6 years old. This is one story, from one country, from one man. Africa has produced others like him. Africa has produced people who stood against them. And the world, every time, has had to decide which ones it was willing to see. We see them. If this story mattered to you, share it with someone who should know it. Subscribe for a new story every week. This is African True Stories.